I hid my $55,000 salary as a cleaner from my son. His wife said, "Your poor mother is a disgrace. Let her leave!" I left silently, but he didn't know that it was I who paid for their house. A month later, I took everything back. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that quiet was the same as peace. For most of my life, I believed that if I kept my head down, worked hard, and loved my family without condition, everything would find its proper place. I was wrong, but it took me 64 years to understand that, and one evening in my son's kitchen to finally accept it. My name is Martha Ellison. I spent 31 years cleaning other people's spaces, offices, lobbies, conference rooms that smelled of expensive cologne and cold ambition. I worked nights at the Hargrove Corporate Center in downtown Cleveland. 4 floors of glass and steel that housed law firms, a financial consulting group, and a tech startup that always left pizza boxes next to the recycling bin. The work was honest. My hands knew what they were doing, and at the end of every shift, I could look at those gleaming floors and know I had done something real. My salary was $55,000 a year, with benefits. Not glamorous, but solid. More solid than most people assumed when they looked at a woman in a gray uniform pushing a mop cart. I had been a widow for 11 years by then. My husband, Gerald, died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March, right after breakfast. He was 55. After that, I learned to need less. I sold the big house on Fernwood Drive, moved into a small apartment on the east side, and started saving with a discipline that would have surprised even Gerald. I didn't need much, but I gave generously, especially to Daniel. Daniel was my only child. 38 years old, handsome in the way Gerald had been handsome. Broad shoulders, easy smile. He worked in logistics management for a regional shipping company, decent salary, nothing spectacular. When he married Christina 6 years ago, I told myself I was happy for him. And for a while, I think I was. Christina was from a family that measured worth in square footage and zip codes. She was not cruel in the beginning. Or perhaps she was, and I simply wasn't paying attention. She had a way of smiling while she said things that landed like small stones. "Oh, Martha, you still take the bus? How retro!" Or, "Daniel mentioned you used to have a bigger place. What happened?" Questions that weren't really questions. Observations designed to establish a hierarchy. But I said nothing. I smiled and passed the bread rolls and told myself that young people were different now, that I was too sensitive, that what mattered was Daniel's happiness. What I never told either of them, not Daniel, not Christina, not anyone, was that I had been quietly paying the mortgage on their house for 2 years. It had started practically enough. Daniel had stretched himself thin buying the property on Sycamore Lane, a 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement and a yard that Christina had insisted on. The mortgage was $2,100 a month. When Daniel called me in a panic 18 months after the wedding, saying they were 3 payments behind and the bank had sent a formal notice, I didn't hesitate. I set up a direct payment from my account to the lender. I told Daniel it was a temporary loan. He said he'd pay me back. We never put it in writing. And month after month the payment went out and nothing came back, and somehow we never spoke of it directly again. Why didn't I ask for a formal agreement? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. The honest answer is that I was his mother. I didn't want to make it transactional. I didn't want him to feel ashamed. I thought love worked better without contracts. I didn't know yet that love without documentation is invisible. The evening it happened, I had come to Sycamore Lane after my shift. It was a Thursday in October, just past 7. I still had my work bag with me, the plain canvas tote with the Hargrove ID clipped to the front. I'd stopped by because Daniel had mentioned his back was bothering him, and I'd brought a heating pad I wasn't using. Christina was in the kitchen when I came in. Daniel was somewhere in the back of the house. I set the bag on the counter and said something ordinary. I don't even remember what. And Christina turned from the stove and looked at me, and something in her expression had shifted. Not sudden, settled, like a decision she had already made. "Martha," she said, and her voice was even, almost pleasant. "I've been meaning to say something for a while. Daniel and I have talked, and honestly, I think it would be better if you didn't come by so often. Your visits make things uncomfortable. And frankly," she paused, her eyes moving briefly to my canvas bag, my uniform pants, my sensible shoes. "Your mother is a poor embarrassment, and she should leave." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The words were quiet and absolute, like a door closing. I stood there for a moment. I looked at the kitchen in the house whose roof I had been keeping over their heads for 24 months. I looked at Christina's face, composed and satisfied. And then I picked up my bag, said nothing, and walked out. I drove home in the dark, both hands steady on the wheel, but my mind was already beginning to move. I did not cry that night. I wanted to, or at least some part of me expected to. I had always been someone who cried quietly and privately, the way my mother had taught me. You feel it, you let it move through you, and then you return to the work. But when I sat down at the kitchen table in my apartment on Chestnut Street, took off my shoes, and spread my hands flat on the surface in front of me, what I felt wasn't grief. It was something colder, more precise. I sat there for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street below. I thought about Christina's face, that particular quality of satisfaction in it, the way she had looked at my shoes. And I thought about Daniel. Where had he been? In the back of the house, she'd said. Did he know she was going to say it? Had they discussed it? The way she claimed, sitting together on the couch I had helped pay for, in the house whose mortgage I processed every single month like a bill of my own? I got up and went to my filing cabinet. A 2-drawer metal unit I kept in the bedroom closet, the kind that looked unremarkable unless you knew what was inside it. I pulled out the folder I had labeled simply SL for Sycamore Lane. In it were 24 months of bank transfer records, every payment, every confirmation number, dates, amounts, the lender's name, Keystone Mortgage Services. $2,100, again and again and again. $50,000, $400 in total, quietly sent, never acknowledged in writing, never repaid. I laid the papers out on the table and looked at them under the lamp. This was the shape of what I had given. Not a gift. I had never called it that. Not a loan, exactly, because there was no agreement. It existed in a strange legal space that I was only beginning to understand might matter very much. Was I angry? Yes. But anger without direction is just heat. What I needed was clarity. I slept badly that night, but I slept. In the morning, I made coffee, sat at the same table, and began to think methodically. The first thing I understood was that I was not powerless. I had money, not a fortune, but a cushion. I had my salary, my savings account at First Federal, with just over $34,000 in it, my work pension accruing steadily, and a small investment account Gerald had opened in the 1990s that I had never touched, and that had grown to just under $28,000. I had no debt. I owned nothing connected to that house except the paper trail in my folder. The second thing I understood was that the mortgage on Sycamore Lane was still in a specific arrangement. One that, when I had set up the payments, the loan officer had confirmed was tied to a co-payment authorization I had signed. I remembered that moment. Daniel had added me as an authorized payer on the account. At the time, it was administrative convenience. But now, I turned that memory over carefully, like a coin. An authorized payer could also stop paying. The question was not whether I had the right to stop. I clearly did. I had been paying voluntarily from my own account, and there was no legal instrument requiring me to continue. The question was, what would happen when I did? The mortgage was 31 months from its third anniversary, which triggered a rate adjustment. If 2 payments were missed, Keystone would issue a formal default notice. 3 missed payments meant the foreclosure process could begin. I knew this because I had read every document carefully when Daniel first called me in a panic. I was thorough that way. I took a notepad and wrote down 4 things. 1. Stop the automatic payment. 2. Consult an attorney about the legal status of the $50,400 already paid. 3. Review what other financial connections I had to their household. 4. Say nothing to Daniel or Christina until I was ready. That last point was the most important. Whatever I decided to do, I could not afford to move from emotion. Christina had dismissed me because she believed I was powerless. A poor woman in a uniform who could be sent away without consequence. If I called Daniel in the morning, upset and accusing, I would only confirm her version of me. I would be the difficult mother, the embarrassment, exactly what she had called me. Number 1, I was going to be something else entirely. I thought about the attorney. I needed someone who handled property and contract disputes, not a general practitioner. My neighbor Ruth had used a woman named Patricia Hale after her landlord dispute. Ruth had described her as the kind of lawyer who takes notes like she's already in court. That sounded right to me. I called Ruth at 9 in the morning and asked for the number. "Martha," Ruth said, hearing something in my voice. "Are you okay?" "I'm going to be," I said. "I just need a name." Patricia Hale's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Euclid Avenue, the kind of office that felt intentionally calm. Neutral walls, a clean desk, diplomas in plain frames. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed, with reading glasses she wore on a cord around her neck and a habit of writing in the margins while you talked. I liked her immediately. I sat across from her on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after the kitchen. I had brought the SL folder, my bank statements, and a written timeline I had prepared the night before. Dates, amounts, and what I remembered of the verbal conversations with Daniel. Patricia read everything without interrupting me. Then she set it all down and looked at me. "You've been paying their mortgage for 24 months, she said. "Yes." "No written loan agreement?" "No." "No promissory note, no signed acknowledgement from your son?" "Nothing in writing." She was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against her notepad. "All right. The good news is that the transfers are documented on your end. Bank records are legally sufficient evidence of payment. The question is what legal theory we'd use if you wanted to pursue recovery of those funds. Unjust enrichment is the most likely avenue. It's not a slam dunk without a written agreement, but given the amounts and the consistency of payment, a judge would likely find it credible." She paused. "Are you looking to recover the money?" I thought about it carefully before I answered. "I'm not sure yet. Right now, I want to understand my options, and I want to stop the payments. That you can do immediately and unilaterally. You're an authorized payer, not a co-borrower. You have no legal obligation to continue." Hearing her say it plainly, no legal obligation, did something specific to the weight I'd been carrying. It didn't disappear, but it shifted into something I could work with. Patricia advised me to send written notification to Keystone Mortgage Services that I was withdrawing as authorized payer and to cancel the automatic transfer from my account. She also suggested I keep all communications with Daniel and Christina in writing going forward, and to avoid any in-person confrontations until I had decided what legal steps, if any, I intended to pursue. "Document everything from here," she said. "Every call, every text, every email. Even if nothing comes of it legally, you'll be glad you have a record." I stopped the automatic payment that evening, online, from my kitchen table. Then I sent the written withdrawal notice to Keystone. My hands were steady the entire time. It was 4 days before Daniel called. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was just past midnight, between my sweep of the 3rd floor and my break. I didn't answer. He called again 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message on my break, sitting on a bench in the service corridor with my coffee, his voice was careful, measured in a way that told me he had planned what to say. "Mom, hey, Christina mentioned you stopped by the other night and, look, I think there might have been a miscommunication. Can you call me back? There's something with the mortgage. The bank sent a notice. I just want to understand what's happening." A miscommunication? Is that what it was? I sat with that word for a long moment, there in the corridor that smelled of cleaning solution and old carpet. A miscommunication. Your wife told me I was a poor embarrassment and to leave. And that was a miscommunication. I did not call back that night. I sent a text the following morning, brief and polite. "Received your message. I'm fine. I'll be in touch soon." Nothing about the mortgage. 2 days later, Daniel appeared at my apartment. I heard the knock at 7:15 in the evening. When I opened the door, he looked like he hadn't slept well. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spread the transfer records, though the folder was back in its cabinet now, and he said without preamble, "Mom, Keystone sent a default warning notice. They said the automatic payment was canceled. What's going on?" I looked at my son. His face was confused and a little frightened. And for a moment I felt the familiar pull, the mother instinct to soothe, to explain, to make it easier for him. But I thought of Christina's voice. "Your mother is a poor embarrassment. She should leave." I decided to stop, I said. "Stop? Why? You can't just—" He caught himself. "I didn't even know you'd been paying. I assumed it was coming from savings, that we'd work it out." "You assumed?" I said quietly. "For 24 months?" He went still. That stillness was the first proof I needed. Not legal proof, but human proof. He had known. Not the full amount, perhaps, not every detail. But he had known the money was coming from somewhere. And he had let himself not ask. Because asking would have meant accounting for it. The conversation did not go well after that. He left frustrated and unsatisfied. But I had what I came for. I had watched his face when I said you assumed for 24 months, and I had seen the thing he was trying not to show me. He knew. He had always known. After Daniel left, I sat for a while in the quiet of my apartment and did something I hadn't done in days. I ate a proper dinner. Soup I had made on Sunday. Bread from the bakery 2 blocks down. I ate slowly, and I thought. And by the time I was washing the bowl, I knew what the next step was. I called Patricia Hale the following morning and told her about Daniel's visit. She listened, then said, "The fact that he acknowledged awareness of the payments, even indirectly, is useful. I want you to write down exactly what he said, as close to verbatim as you can, with the date and time. Send it to me today." I did, as soon as I got off the phone. A full page of notes, typed up and emailed. Then I went to see a second person. His name was Robert Finch, a financial advisor I had used twice before. Once when Gerald died and I had to restructure everything, and once 3 years ago when I rolled over a retirement account. His office was in a low brick building in Lakewood, comfortable and unpretentious. I told him I wanted to review my full financial picture and separate my assets in a way that made my personal accounts completely clear and unambiguous. He pulled up my records and we spent 2 hours going through everything: savings, pension, the investment account. I had him help me open a new dedicated account at a different institution, one with no connection whatsoever to anything Daniel or Christina might have had a peripheral awareness of. "Are you expecting a legal situation?" Robert asked. "I'm expecting to be prepared for one," I said. He nodded and didn't ask further. He was a practical man. For a few days, nothing happened. Daniel sent 2 texts, one asking if we could talk, one asking if I was doing okay. I replied to each briefly and without information. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, 11 days after that kitchen conversation, my phone rang and the name on the screen was Christina. I let it ring through. She called again 30 seconds later. I answered. "Martha." Her voice was different from the evenings at the house, sharper, less curated. "I think we need to have a real conversation about what you're doing." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I stopped a voluntary payment." "You stopped? You stopped the mortgage payment on our house. Do you understand that? The bank is going to—" She stopped, and I could hear her recalibrating. When she spoke again, the sharpness was wrapped in something that wanted to sound reasonable. "Look, I understand there may have been some tension when you were here, but this is not the way to handle a family disagreement. You're going to damage your relationship with Daniel. And honestly, you could be putting yourself in a difficult position legally if you're trying to—" "Christina," I said, "I have a lawyer." Silence. "I've been advised not to discuss the particulars on the phone," I continued. My voice surprised me. It was so steady. "If you or Daniel have questions about the payments, your attorney can contact mine." I gave her Patricia Hale's office name, then I said goodbye and hung up. What followed was not silence, but something more like the pause before weather changes. 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, both of them came to my apartment building. I saw their car in the lot from my window before they buzzed up. I let them in, not because I wasn't prepared, but because I had decided that refusing to see them would give them a narrative. "She won't even talk to us. She's being unreasonable." They came upstairs. Daniel was pale. Christina's jaw was set in a way that signaled she was leading this visit. She sat at my kitchen table and said, without any preliminary warmth, that I had no legal right to withhold payments that I had committed to making, that they had arranged their finances around my contributions, that if I was trying to manipulate them, I should know that Daniel could contest the payments as family support arrangements, which might have tax implications for me. Did she actually understand what she was saying? Or was she repeating something she'd found on an internet forum at 2 in the morning, desperate and frightened? "The word you're looking for," I said, "is unjust enrichment. And it generally applies to the person who received money they had no legal right to, not the person who gave it." I kept my voice pleasant. "You're welcome to have your attorney reach out to mine." Christina's face did something complicated. She looked at Daniel. Daniel said quietly, "Mom, come on. We just want to work this out." "Then have your attorney call Patricia Hale," I said. "That's the appropriate way to work it out." They left 20 minutes later. Christina's heels were sharp on the hallway floor, and the sound got farther and farther away until it was gone. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment with my eyes shut. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked, but I had not moved an inch. That weekend, I drove out to Lake Erie and sat near the water for an afternoon. I brought a thermos of coffee and a book I'd been meaning to read for months. I didn't think about the mortgage or the lawyers or Christina's face. I watched the water and let myself rest. I needed the stillness because I knew the next part was coming. The week after the lake was a quiet one, which I didn't trust. In my experience, that particular kind of quiet, the kind where people who have been loud suddenly go still, usually meant they were reorganizing. I was right. On Wednesday evening, Daniel called without Christina on the line. I knew the difference immediately. His voice was softer, more hesitant, the way it had been when he was a teenager and wanted something he wasn't sure I'd give him. He said he wanted to apologize for the tension, that Christina had been stressed, that the house situation was putting pressure on both of them, that he knew things had gotten out of hand. He didn't mention what Christina had said to me in the kitchen. He spoke around it with the practiced ease of someone who has decided that the center of the problem doesn't need to be named. I was thinking, he said after a pause, that maybe we could find a different arrangement. You know, something that worked for everyone. Maybe you could come back to the payments just temporarily, and we'd draw something up properly this time. A real agreement. Christina even said she'd be open to that. I sat with the phone against my ear and thought about what he was offering me. A real agreement. Now. Now. When the threat of consequences had become concrete. Not 2 years ago, when I was simply giving. Not 6 months ago, when I might have asked and been grateful for the suggestion. Now. Why did people think that offering to do the right thing at the last possible moment erased the 24 months of not doing it? I appreciate you calling, Daniel, I said. I really do. But I've asked you to work through the attorneys. That's still my position. Mom, attorneys make everything worse. That's been your experience, I said. It's not mine. He was quiet. Then, she said things she shouldn't have said when you were here. I know that. I know you know, I said. Another silence. Longer. I don't know what you want from me, he finally said. And there was something raw in it. Genuine, I thought. But genuine wasn't enough to undo what had been built over 2 years of silence. Right now, I said. I want you to get some rest. Good night, Daniel. I hung up and stood at my kitchen window for a while, looking at the street. The call had been the first act. I suspected the second was coming. It came in the form of a card, which I found in my mailbox 3 days later. A card, actual paper, the kind you buy at a drugstore, with a faint floral design on the cover. Inside, in Christina's handwriting, which I recognized from birthday cards over the years, was a message that took me 3 readings to fully absorb. Martha, I know I've been difficult. I've been under enormous pressure, and I took it out on you, which wasn't fair. I'd like to start over if you're willing. Christina, no mention of the mortgage. No mention of what she'd actually said. Difficult. As if she had simply been short-tempered. As if the word she'd used, embarrassment, was a small lapse, a blip. Not a judgment she had delivered while looking at my work shoes. I put the card on my counter and looked at it. Was I supposed to be moved? I asked myself that plainly. Was I supposed to feel that this small paper gesture outweighed $50,400 in 2 years of silence and a quiet evening in October, when I had been sent out of a house I'd been holding up? I took a photo of the card and emailed it to Patricia, noting the date and that it had arrived without any accompanying legal communication. Keep it, Patricia replied. It's evidence of informal contact after we established the formal channel. Useful if they later claim you were unresponsive. I kept it. The support I was looking for didn't come from a lawyer's office, though. It came from closer. I had a small circle. Ruth next door, my co-worker Diane, who had been at Hargrove for 19 years, and my sister Peggy in Columbus, who called every Sunday without fail. That Saturday, I drove to Columbus. Peggy and I sat in her kitchen, the one that always smelled like coffee and whatever she was baking, and I told her everything. All of it. The payments, the kitchen, Christina's face, the card, the attorneys. Peggy listened without interrupting. When I was done, she poured us both more coffee and said, "Martha, I need you to hear me say this plainly. You are not the problem in this story." It sounds simple. It sounds like something everyone should already know about themselves. But there is a particular way that someone who loves you, who has known you your entire life, can say something true and land it differently than any logic or any legal opinion can. I felt it move through me like something unclenching. "I've been afraid," I admitted, "that I'm being cold, that I should just forgive and repair it." "You can forgive," Peggy said, "without funding them." I drove home on Sunday evening and felt, for the first time in weeks, like my footing was solid. The following Monday, I asked Patricia where we stood, and she told me she had received formal contact from Daniel and Christina's attorney, a man named Greg Novak, who had sent a letter claiming that my withdrawal of payments constituted a breach of an implied agreement and that they intended to pursue damages. I read the letter at Patricia's desk and felt strangely relieved. They had made it official. Good, so would I. Patricia's response to Novak's letter was measured and immediate. She outlined, in precise legal language, that I had been a voluntary authorized payer with no contractual obligation, and that any claim of implied agreement would need to demonstrate clear evidence of mutual intent, which, given the complete absence of written documentation on their end, would be a significant evidentiary challenge. She copied me on the letter and called to summarize. "They're testing you," she said. "Novak's letter is a pressure move. They want to see if the threat of litigation makes you fold." "Does it?" I asked, and I think she heard something in my voice because she made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Based on our conversations so far," she said, "no, I don't think it does." She was right. But I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't afraid. Fear and resolve, I was learning, were not opposites. They could exist in the same breath, in the same moment. Fear of what could be lost or damaged, and resolve about what would not be surrendered. 4 days after Patricia sent her response, Daniel and Christina came to my apartment again. This time, I had not seen their car first. They buzzed up without warning on a Sunday afternoon when I was reading on the couch in my housecoat. I almost didn't let them up, but I thought of what Peggy had said, "You can forgive without funding them," and I thought about the narrative again. I buzzed them in. They came in together, and the apartment immediately felt different with the two of them in it. More pressurized, like a room with a weather system moving through it. I offered them seats. I did not offer coffee. I sat across from them with my hands in my lap and waited. Christina went first, and the performance was notable. She was composed, warmer than I had seen her in years, her voice pitched to the register of reason. She said that she and Daniel had talked, really talked, and that they felt terrible about how things had unfolded, that she personally felt terrible about the things she had said, that they understood I was hurt. But then, and here the register shifted just slightly, the way a musical key changes under a melody so gradually you almost don't notice. She said that the situation they were in was not sustainable, that the mortgage was now in formal default proceedings, that they stood to lose the house, and that whatever had passed between us, I had to understand that there was more at stake here than feelings. "You built a relationship with this house," she said. "You were part of this. You made choices that led Daniel and me to make plans. And now those plans are at risk." She paused. "Let that settle. Withdrawing now, whatever your feelings are, is not something you can do without consequences for all of us." Was she blaming me for the default on a mortgage I had been paying out of my own pocket for 2 years, while she was in that house calling me an embarrassment? I looked at her carefully, at the careful construction of what she was saying, the way it reframed every dynamic, made my choice to stop paying sound like an act of sabotage rather than a withdrawal of extraordinary generosity. Christina, I said, I've asked you to communicate through the attorneys. Martha. Now something harder broke through the composure. We don't have time for attorneys. We have a 30-day window before this goes to foreclosure status, and there is a permanent mark on our credit. You can end this right now. Today. If you reinstate the payments? I'm not reinstating the payments, I said. We can drop the legal claim and… My attorney will contact yours, I said. Daniel made a sound. Not quite a word, something between frustration and helplessness. Mom, please, we could lose our home. The home, I said carefully, that I have been paying for. A silence opened in the room that was different from the others. Not uncomfortable, but revealing. Because in that silence, neither of them said what I had expected. Neither of them said yes, and we are deeply sorry, and we want to make it right. What Christina said after a moment was, we can't be responsible for decisions you made on our behalf without consulting us. There it was, clean and complete. The $50,400 I had given was now a decision I had made unilaterally, something they hadn't asked for, a choice I was now trying to leverage against them. I stood up. I think you should go, I said. Christina's composure broke entirely. She stood too, and her voice came out sharp and high. You are being vindictive. You are a bitter old woman who can't stand that your son has his own life, and you are using money as a weapon because you have nothing else. Please leave, I said. Daniel took her arm. She was rigid for a moment, then she turned and walked out. Daniel paused in the doorway, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. It had shame in it, and frustration, and something else. Then he left too. I closed the door. I leaned my back against it. My hands, when I looked at them, were trembling slightly. I was frightened. Not of them exactly, but of the fact that love and damage can live in such close proximity to each other. Daniel was still my son. That had not changed. And maybe that was what frightened me most, but I felt something else underneath the fear. Something that had been building since the kitchen in October, since the transfer records on the table, since Patricia Hale's clean and certain voice. I was not going to move. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-January, 6 weeks after that Sunday afternoon, when I'd asked them to leave. It was not a courtroom. Patricia had recommended mediation as an initial step, both to demonstrate good faith and because, as she put it, I'd rather let them reveal themselves in a room than spend your money on a trial if we can avoid it. The location was a law office in Midtown Cleveland, a conference room on the 8th floor with a long table, water glasses, and a mediator named Stephen Cho, who was a former family court judge and looked like a man who had stopped being surprised by anything people did to each other. Patricia sat to my left. Across the table were Daniel and Christina, and beside them their attorney, Greg Novak, a man in his late 40s who wore a good suit and had the manner of someone accustomed to winning through volume and repetition. I had been prepared. Patricia had spent an hour with me 2 days before, going through exactly what would happen, what I would be asked, and, most importantly, what I did not need to explain or justify. You don't have to defend yourself, she had said. Let the documents do it. The documents were considerable. Patricia had assembled them into a single organized binder. 24 months of bank transfer records, each with the corresponding Keystone mortgage confirmation. The authorization form I had signed as an authorized payer. Daniel's text message to me from November, in which he had written, and this was the sentence Patricia had highlighted. I know you've been carrying a lot for us, and I don't say it enough, but thank you. He had sent that text 7 months before the kitchen incident. He had never imagined I would be sitting across a table from him with it printed on page 17 of a legal binder. Novak opened for their side. His argument was essentially what Christina had gestured toward in my apartment, that I had voluntarily entered into an informal family support arrangement, that Daniel and Christina had structured their lives in reasonable reliance on that arrangement, and that my sudden withdrawal constituted a breach of an implied agreement. He used phrases like detrimental reliance and reasonable expectation with practiced fluency. When it was Patricia's turn, she was brief and precise. She noted that no legal instrument had ever been created, that I had no contractual obligation, that under Ohio law, implied agreement claims in family financial contexts require clear and convincing evidence of mutual intent, which, she noted, did not appear to exist, given that her client had been characterized in her own son's home as, and here she read directly from the notes I had given her, a poor embarrassment who should leave. That phrase, read aloud in a conference room in a measured legal voice, did something to the air. Novak's expression didn't change. He was too trained for that. But Christina's did. A flush moved up her throat. The individual who made that statement, Patricia continued, did so in a home being financially supported by my client, apparently without full awareness of that fact. We would argue that this speaks directly to the nature of the arrangement, not a mutual agreement, but a unilateral act of generosity that was never acknowledged, discussed, or reciprocated, and that was rendered invisible precisely because it was convenient for the beneficiaries to treat it as invisible. Stephen Cho was writing notes. He had not looked up from his pad. Novak began to reframe. He suggested that the text message could be interpreted broadly, that carrying a lot was vague. Patricia had anticipated this. She produced the bank statements for the corresponding months, laid them next to the texts, and let the alignment speak. $2,100. $2,100. $2,100. 24 times. This isn't vague, Patricia said simply. Christina leaned over to Novak and whispered something. He listened, then said, "My clients would like to take a brief recess." We recessed. In the hallway, Patricia and I stood near a window that looked down at the street, and she said quietly, "They're rattled. Novak is probably telling them right now that the detrimental reliance argument is shakier than he'd hoped. Do you think they'll settle?" "I think Novak is telling them to." When we reconvened, something had shifted. Christina was still, controlled. But it was the stillness of someone concentrating very hard on maintaining a surface. Daniel looked like a man who had received news he had been half expecting for a long time. Novak made a settlement offer. They would drop the breach claim if I agreed to waive my right to pursue recovery of the payments already made. I looked at Patricia. She looked at me. "That's their position," she said neutrally. I thought about Peggy's kitchen. I thought about the lake. I thought about October and the canvas bag in the kitchen and the word she had used. Embarrassment. "No," I said. Novak blinked. "Mrs. Ellison." "The answer is no," I said. "We'll continue." The session ended shortly after. In the elevator down, Patricia said, "They weren't expecting that." "I know," I said. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes," I said, and I was. The weeks that followed the mediation were the most methodical of my life. Patricia had advised me that if we were moving toward litigation, we needed to be absolutely thorough, and so we were. She filed for recovery of the $50,400 under unjust enrichment theory in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court, attaching the full documentary record, bank transfers, the authorization form, the confirmation numbers, and Novak responded by filing a counter-complaint, as expected. But something had changed after the mediation. Whether it was the quality of Patricia's documentation, the specific and damning clarity of the side-by-side bank statement presentation, or the simple fact that my refusal to settle had signaled I was prepared to go further. I didn't know. What I knew was that within 3 weeks of the filings, Novak contacted Patricia to request another settlement discussion. This time, the terms were different. Daniel and Christina agreed to the following: a formal written acknowledgement that I had made 24 monthly payments totaling $50,400 to Keystone Mortgage Services on their behalf, a signed and notarized promissory note for repayment of the full amount over a period of 7 years at 3% interest, which Patricia had structured carefully and which brought the total repayment to just over $58,000, and the withdrawal, with prejudice, of their breach of implied agreement claim. The signing took place on a Tuesday morning at Patricia's office. Daniel came without Christina, who had apparently decided that she did not wish to be present for the formality of her defeat. He sat across from Patricia and the notary, and he signed each page where indicated. His hand moved steadily but slowly, the way a person moves when they are doing something they cannot take back. When it was done, he set the pen down and did not look up immediately. He looked at the table, then he looked at me. "I'm sorry," he said. Not to Patricia, not to the room, to me. The word landed the way words do when they are too late to change anything, but are still true. I looked at my son's face. This face I had known since it was red and new and furious with the shock of being born. And what I felt was complicated in ways I was not going to untangle at a conference table with a notary present. I did not say it was fine. It wasn't fine, and telling him otherwise would have been a kindness he hadn't earned and wouldn't have believed. "I know," I said. He nodded once, slowly, as if that was the answer he had expected and had needed to hear regardless. He stood, shook Patricia's hand with the reflexive politeness of someone running on muscle memory, and left without further conversation. Patricia walked him to the door and came back. We sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, the particular quiet of a concluded thing. "You handled that well," she said. "I handled it honestly," I said, which felt more accurate. But the settlement was only one layer of what had resolved. The other consequence, the one that required no lawyers, no documents, no signatures, had been accumulating by its own weight for months. With no one covering the mortgage and the matter in formal legal proceedings, Keystone's default process had continued its mechanical progress. By the time the settlement was signed, Daniel and Christina were 4 months behind on payments they now had to make entirely on their own. The house on Sycamore Lane entered a workout arrangement with the lender, a modified repayment plan that extended their loan term and significantly increased their monthly obligation going forward. They remained in the house, but barely, and only because Daniel had appealed to his father's side of the family for emergency assistance. Aunts and cousins, who, from what I gathered through the reliable indirect channels that families always maintain, were not entirely pleased to be asked. The conversation, I was told, had been uncomfortable. Daniel had apparently spent years presenting himself and Christina as doing very well. The request reframed that story entirely. Christina's position at her part-time event planning firm ended sometime in late winter. Whether she left voluntarily or was let go, I never learned and did not pursue. What I knew was that she had taken a full-time position at a hotel chain in their corporate events department. Steady work, demanding hours, the kind of role she had always mentioned in the third person, as something other people did when they needed to. I did not take pleasure in picturing her there. That would have required continuing to center her in my thinking, and I had stopped doing that. What I did know was that the life on Sycamore Lane had contracted noticeably. The car lease was returned. The daughter, my granddaughter Lily, and this was the dimension of all of it that still pressed against something unresolved in me, had been withdrawn from the private preschool where she'd been enrolled. Small losses by some measures, but they were the shape of what remained when the invisible support was finally made visible by its absence. The repayment checks began arriving 2 months after the signing, direct deposits, per the terms, on the 15th of each month. I transferred each one to the account I'd opened with Robert Finch, and did not linger over them. They were not satisfaction. They were simply what was owed, arriving on schedule. I gave notice at Hargrove in March. My supervisor, Phil, shook my hand, said he was sorry to lose me, and I thanked him, and meant it. I cleaned out my locker. I returned my ID badge. I walked down the service corridor for the last time. The one that smelled of cleaning solution and old carpet. The one where I had sat on a bench in the middle of the night, listening to Daniel's careful voicemail. And out through the lobby, and into a cold March morning that smelled like the lake. My hands were free. My schedule was my own. The next part was mine to decide. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in Cleveland. Tentative, then committed, then suddenly everywhere at once. By April, the tree on the corner of my block had gone from bare to full, without me quite catching the moment it happened. I noticed it one morning from my window with my coffee, and I thought, that's how change works usually. Not in the moment of decision, but in the accumulation of small, unremarkable days that follow it. I had spent the first month after leaving Hargrove doing very little of what anyone would call productive, and I had done it deliberately. I slept until 7. I read books all the way through, which I hadn't done in years because I'd always fallen asleep before 10 from exhaustion. I walked along the lakefront in the mornings and along it again in the evenings, if I felt like it. I had coffee with Ruth twice a week. I drove to Columbus every other weekend to see Peggy, and we cooked together and talked until late. And I slept better in her guest room than I had in my own bed for most of the previous 2 years. I was not lonely. That surprised me. Or rather, it confirmed something I had half known for a long time, that the loneliness I had been experiencing wasn't about solitude. It was about being present in a situation that didn't see me. Once I was out of that situation, being alone felt entirely different. It felt like space. That summer, I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center 3 blocks from my apartment. I had always wanted to learn. Gerald had been the artistic one, but somewhere along the way I had absorbed the idea that there were people who did that kind of thing and people who didn't, and I was in the second category. The instructor was a woman named Helene, early 60s, patient and funny, who told me on the first day that the biggest obstacle most adult beginners had was the belief that their work needed to be good. It doesn't need to be good, she said. It needs to be yours. I painted badly for 4 weeks, and then, gradually, less badly. I painted the lake. I painted Peggy's garden. I painted the view from my kitchen window at dusk. In September, I took a trip. I had not traveled in 11 years, since before Gerald died, really. I went to Savannah, Georgia, because I had seen a photograph of it once and thought the squares looked like somewhere I wanted to sit. I sat in 3 of them over 4 days. I ate shrimp and grits at a restaurant near the river and read the entire afternoon. I walked until my feet ached and then walked a little more. I took a photograph of every iron gate I passed. No one needed me to be anywhere. No one was waiting on me. I sent Peggy a postcard. The repayment checks came every month, reliable as weather. I put them away and tried not to think about them too hard, because if I thought about them, I started thinking about everything they represented, and that led to thoughts I was still learning how to sit with. Daniel and I had spoken twice since the signing. Brief, careful conversations, mostly about Lily. He told me she had started kindergarten. He sent a photo. She had Gerald's eyes, which I had not expected to hit me as hard as it did. Was reconciliation possible? I didn't know. I thought it would depend on whether Daniel could build himself into a person capable of it, and that wasn't something I could do for him. What I could do was remain honest and leave the door open, even if I wasn't standing at it. Christina, from what I gathered, was not managing the adjustment well. I heard through indirect channels. Peggy knew someone whose daughter worked in the same social circle. That the house on Sycamore Lane had become a source of constant friction. That the financial pressure had stripped away several layers of the life they had imagined for themselves. The trips they'd posted about on social media had stopped. The dinners with certain friends had thinned out. There was apparently a lot of blame being distributed in their household, and very little of it was landing where it originated. Christina had started working full-time again. A position at a hotel chain in their events department, the kind of work she had always described, I had noticed, as something other people did. Whether she was unhappy about it or had found a way to make peace with it, I genuinely didn't know. I was not watching her closely. I had spent too many years in proximity to her evaluation of me to want to spend any of my free time evaluating her in return. What I knew was that the life I had held together for them, the invisible scaffolding of $2,100 a month, the quiet maintenance of a structure they had treated as permanent and given, was not something they could replicate on their own, not at the scale they wanted. Maybe in time they would find a different scale that fit them. That was their work to do. Mine was different. In October, exactly 1 year after the kitchen, after the canvas bag, after the shoes, I sat in Helene's class and worked on a painting of the lake at evening. The water came out in blues and grays with a thin line of gold at the horizon that I hadn't planned and couldn't have planned. Helene stopped at my table and looked at it for a moment. "That's yours," she said. I looked at it. "Yes," I said. "It is. They called me invisible. I let them." Because invisible doesn't mean powerless. It means they forgot to watch. What I learned is this: never let love become a reason to disappear. Generosity given in silence is generosity taken for granted. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to be seen. And you are allowed to let the structure fall if you were the only one holding it up. What would you have done in my place? If this story moved you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening to the end. On Mother's Day, my millionaire son asked, "Mom, are you happy with the $500 I send?" I said nothing. He didn't know I had seen his bank statement, $80,000 a month on his mistress. When his wife entered the room, I took out my phone and showed her. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I was 71 years old when my son looked me in the eye and asked me if $500 a month was enough to make me happy. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I was not a bitter woman. I was not a suspicious mother who read dark meanings into everything her child said. I raised Richard alone after his father, Gerald, passed from a heart attack in 1998. Rich was only 17 then. I worked double shifts at the hospital where I was a medical records clerk for 22 years. I skipped vacations. I bought my clothes at Goodwill. I made sure that boy had everything he needed to become what he became, and he became a lot. By the time he was 45, Richard ran a mid-sized wealth management firm in Columbus with 31 employees and clients whose names occasionally appeared in local business journals. He drove a black Audi. He owned a house in Dublin, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood with stone mailboxes and invisible fences. His wife Elena was a pediatrician, quiet and kind, the sort of woman who remembered your birthday without Facebook reminding her. They had 2 children, Marcus, 14, and Lily, 11. I lived 40 minutes away in the same house where I'd raised Rich. 3 bedrooms, a leaky gutter I kept meaning to fix, a vegetable garden in the back that Gerald had started and I'd never stopped tending. Rich had offered to buy me something newer, something in a better part of town. I said no. I said this house had my husband's hands in the walls, and I wasn't ready to leave that. He nodded and reduced my monthly transfer to $500. That's not entirely fair. He had been sending me money since he turned 30. First 300, then 500. It was never discussed as an obligation. It arrived quietly in my account on the first of every month, and I quietly used it for utilities and groceries and the occasional prescription that my insurance didn't cover. I never asked for more. That wasn't the kind of woman I was. The first sign came the previous autumn, maybe 8 months before Mother's Day. Rich had left his laptop open on my kitchen table when he and Elena brought the grandchildren over for Thanksgiving. He'd stepped outside to take a call. A long call, the kind where a man walks to the far end of the yard and keeps his back to the house. I wasn't snooping, I was clearing plates. But I passed the table and I saw the screen. And what I saw was a wire transfer confirmation. The amount was $6,400. The recipient was listed as V. Moore. The memo line said, November rent. I kept moving. I stacked the plates. I told myself it was a business arrangement. An employee, perhaps. A property he managed. Rich was in finance. There were 100 explanations. But I thought about it later that night, alone in my bedroom with the television on and the sound off. $6,400 for rent in Columbus. The second sign came in February. Elena called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. We had a warm but structured relationship. Sunday dinners, school events, the occasional weekday text about the children. A Tuesday call meant something had shifted. She didn't say anything alarming. She said she was tired. She said Rich had been traveling more than usual. She said she sometimes felt like she was raising Marcus and Lily by herself, and then she laughed as if she'd said something embarrassing and changed the subject to Lily's piano recital. I listened. I said the right things. But when I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time looking at the dark window above the sink. The third sign was a name, Vanessa. I heard it once, by accident, when I called Rich's cell on a Saturday morning, and he answered thinking he was declining the call. I heard him say, in a completely different voice than the one he used with me, softer, lower, a voice I didn't recognize as my son's. Vanessa, I told you not to. And then the line went dead. He called back 4 minutes later and told me he'd been in a meeting on a Saturday. I said nothing. I wrote the name down on the notepad I keep by the telephone. And then came Mother's Day. Rich and Elena brought the children over for brunch. Elena had made a fruit salad and bought me a begonia for the porch. The children gave me drawings. It was a pleasant morning, the kind that photographs well. After lunch, when Elena took Lily to the bathroom and Marcus went outside to look at something on his phone, Rich sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He folded his hands. He smiled the smile he used in meetings. Mom, he said, I just want to make sure. Are you happy with the $500 I send every month? Is it enough for what you need? And I looked at my son. This man I had worked myself half to death to raise, this man with the Audi and the stone mailbox and the voice I no longer recognized. And I said nothing, because the night before, I had found a bank statement. It had come to my house by mistake. A misdirected piece of mail that should have gone to Rich's office address, but had somehow ended up in my mailbox. I had opened it without thinking, the way you open anything with your name adjacent to it, and I had seen the itemized outflows for March. There, in a monthly transfer column, in plain black ink, V. Moore, $80,000. $80,000 every month, to the woman whose name I had written on my notepad. I looked at my son across my kitchen table with his folded hands and his meeting smile, and I said absolutely nothing, because I was deciding what to do with what I knew. They left around 3 o'clock. I stood on the porch and waved at the minivan until it turned the corner. And then I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table in the same chair Rich had sat in 2 hours earlier. The begonia Elena had brought was on the counter. The children's drawings were on the refrigerator. The fruit salad bowl was in the drying rack. I sat there for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it would be easy to describe this moment as purely righteous, a wronged woman sharpening her resolve. But that's not what it was. What it was, first and most powerfully, was grief. Richard was my son. I had held him when he had fevers. I had driven him to basketball practice in the dark on January mornings. I had attended his college graduation alone because there was no one else to sit beside me in the bleachers, and I had cried in the car afterward from pure pride. This man who was sending $80,000 a month to another woman while asking me if $500 was enough. He was also the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching baseball. Those two things were both true at the same time, and that was the hardest part. But grief, I have learned, is not incompatible with clarity. And I was very clear. I was clear about what the bank statement meant. $80,000 a month was not a business expense. It was not a consulting fee or a property arrangement. It was a life, a full, maintained, comfortable life that Rich was funding in secret while his wife worked long shifts at a pediatric practice and came home to raise 2 children, largely alone. While I lived on $500 a month and fixed my own gutters. I was clear about what was at stake. Elena did not know. I was certain of that. The woman who called me on a Tuesday evening to quietly admit she felt alone was not a woman who knew her husband was spending close to $1 million a year on someone else. She was a woman in the dark, and the dark was not kind to her. I was clear about what Rich would do if I simply confronted him. I had raised him. I knew how his mind worked when he was cornered. He would minimize, then explain, then apologize in a way that was really a negotiation. He would tell me it was complicated. He would tell me Elena had her own issues. He would tell me I didn't understand the pressures he was under. And if none of that worked, he would become cold. The board meeting cold. The folded hands cold. And he would find a way to make my access to my grandchildren contingent on my silence. Not overtly. Rich was never overt, but it would happen. So I did not confront him. What I did instead was go to my desk. I keep a 2-drawer filing cabinet in the back bedroom that Gerald bought in 1991, and I have never replaced. In it, I keep every document that matters. My will, the deed to the house, insurance policies, tax returns going back 15 years. I opened the top drawer and I found the misdirected envelope, which I had placed there the night before, under a folder labeled Utilities. I took it out and I read it again. Slowly this time, column by column. The account was in Rich's personal name, not the business. The March statement showed his regular income deposit, $240,000 from the firm, and the outflows. His mortgage, a car payment, what appeared to be a second car payment, and then the transfers. V. Moore received $80,000 on the 3rd of every month. There were also smaller transfers. Restaurant charges, what looked like travel expenses, a recurring charge to a jeweler in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. I got out my yellow legal pad and I made a list. What I had: 1 bank statement, 1 month, misdirected mail. What I needed: pattern, documentation, timeline. What I could not do: tip Rich off before I had enough. The plan was not complicated. I did not want drama. I did not want a scene. What I wanted was for Elena to have the full truth, documented, undeniable, laid out clearly, so that she could make her own decisions with her eyes open. That was all. I wasn't trying to punish Rich, though I won't pretend the thought gave me no satisfaction. I was trying to make sure that a good woman didn't spend the next 10 years wondering why her life felt hollow and never knowing the real answer. I wrote down 3 steps. First, secure the document I already had. I drove the following morning to the UPS store on Morse Road and made 3 copies of the bank statement. I kept one at home, mailed one to my sister Carol in Cincinnati with a note that said, "Hold this for me, don't ask questions yet," and placed one in a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Second, find out more without exposing myself. I knew Rich's professional address and the name of his firm, Callahan Capital Advisors. I knew his assistant's name was a young man named Derek, who occasionally called me to confirm holiday plans. I was not going to call Derek, but I knew that Rich had, on 2 separate occasions over the past year, mentioned a property in German Village, a neighborhood of renovated brick row houses in the south part of Columbus, expensive and quiet. I had assumed it was a client property. I now had a different theory. Third, I needed a witness I could trust, someone who could be present when the moment came, because I had already decided there would be a moment, a specific, deliberate moment, and whose presence would prevent Rich from dismissing what happened as the confused act of a confused old woman. I thought about who that person might be, and then I did something I had not done in years. I called my neighbor Barbara Ostrowski, who was a retired paralegal, and I asked her if she wanted to have coffee the following Thursday. She said yes. I hung up and looked at the begonia on the counter. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that too. I was 71 years old, and I was preparing to do something that would permanently alter my relationship with my only child. And I did not know yet what the other side of that would look like. But I had looked at my son across that table, and I had remembered the question he asked me. $500 a month. Are you happy with that, Mom? And I picked up my legal pad and kept writing. The Thursday coffee with Barbara Ostrowski went for 2.5 hours. I had known Barbara for 11 years. She moved in next door after her husband passed, and we developed the kind of friendship that forms between 2 self-sufficient women of a certain age. Reliable, undemanding, built on a shared understanding that neither of us had the patience for pretense. She had spent 26 years as a paralegal for a family law firm in Westerville. She knew what a wire transfer record meant. She knew what a paper trail was for. I did not tell her everything at once. I told her enough. I told her I had come across financial information that I believed my daughter-in-law needed to see, and that I was trying to gather what was necessary before acting, and that when the time came, I would like her to be there. Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me one question. Is this about protecting Elena or punishing Rich? I thought about it genuinely. Both, I said, but mostly Elena. She nodded and refilled her coffee. Then let's do it right, she said. That conversation steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. There is something about being heard by another person, someone practical and calm, that converts private anxiety into something more manageable. I drove home feeling less like a frightened old woman and more like someone with a task. The following Saturday, I drove to German Village. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do. I did not hire a private investigator. I did not follow anyone or photograph anyone. What I did was drive to a neighborhood in my own city and park on a public street and read the addresses on the buildings. Columbus property records are public. I had spent 2 evenings on the county auditor's website, a site anyone can access from any computer, searching transfers and ownership under the name Moore. It took longer than I expected because I was searching broadly, but on the second evening, I found it. A property on Reinhard Avenue in German Village, purchased 14 months earlier, listed under the name Vanessa R. Moore. Purchase price, $410,000. Cash transaction. No mortgage. Cash. I sat in the car on Reinhard Avenue for about 10 minutes. The house was a renovated brick row house, narrow and deep, with a black front door and a small stone planter that held a rosemary topiary. It was a beautiful house, the kind of house you see in lifestyle magazines. Someone had chosen every detail carefully. I did not get out of the car. I drove home. The second bank statement arrived the following week, not misdirected this time, but forwarded. Rich's firm had apparently updated its mailing records partway through a billing cycle, and the April statement came to my address before the correction took effect. I will confess that when I saw the envelope, I felt, alongside everything else, a strange and irrational sense that the situation had its own momentum now, that the information was finding me, not the other way around. April looked identical to March. V. Moore, $80,000, third of the month. The jeweler charge was there again. There was also a new line, a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, for 4 nights in early April. I checked my memory. Rich had told Elena he'd been in Charlotte for a client conference that week. I remembered because Elena had mentioned it on one of our calls. She said the children had had a stomach bug, and she'd been alone with them. Charlotte and Charleston. 2 different cities. 1 letter apart. I added the April statement to my file. I now had 2 months of documentation, a property record in Vanessa Moore's name, a cash purchase price, and a 14-month ownership timeline that aligned with the period during which Rich had become, according to Elena, increasingly absent. What I did not yet have was Vanessa Moore herself. Not as a person, not as a presence. I had a name, an address, a number on a page. Part of me preferred it that way. If she remained abstract, I could focus on what mattered. Elena, the moment I had been preparing for. It was during this period that Rich called me on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not unusual in itself, but the tone of the call was different. He asked how I was. He asked if I'd had any unusual mail lately, phrased casually, the way you'd ask about the weather. He said his firm had had some mailing issues, and he wanted to make sure nothing had ended up at my address by mistake. I told him nothing had come. I said it without hesitation, without a pause, in the same voice I used to tell him dinner was ready when he was 15. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment. He knew something had been sent. He didn't know if I'd received it, and if I had, he didn't know whether I'd understood what I was looking at. He was testing me gently, the way he did everything. Not confrontation, probe first, then adjust. I had passed his test, but the clock had changed. I called Barbara that evening. "It needs to happen soon," I said. "He's starting to look around." "How soon?" she asked. I thought about Elena's schedule. I knew that she had Sundays off, and that she typically brought the children to visit me on the last Sunday of the month, sometimes with Rich, sometimes alone if he had work obligations. The last Sunday of May was 12 days away. 12 days, I said. Barbara said she would be available. I spent those 12 days doing only one additional thing. I organized. I placed the 2 bank statements in a clear plastic sleeve. I printed the property record from the county auditor's website. I wrote on a single sheet of paper, in plain language, the timeline. When the transfers began, how much, the Charleston Hotel, the property purchase. 1 page, no drama, just facts in chronological order. I put it all in a manila envelope and wrote nothing on the outside. And then I waited for the last Sunday of May. The last Sunday of May was warm, with the kind of Ohio sky that looks freshly painted. Pale blue, high clouds, the sort of morning that makes you feel briefly that everything might be all right. Elena arrived at 11 with Marcus and Lily. Rich was supposed to be at a brunch with a client and was not expected. That was what Elena told me when she called Friday to confirm. I had built the plan around that. Barbara was sitting in my kitchen when they pulled in, her coffee in front of her, dressed plainly. I had told Marcus and Lily she was my neighbor who stopped in occasionally. Children accept these things without question. I gave the children popsicles from the freezer and suggested they sit on the back porch. Lily had a book. Marcus had his phone. They were content. Elena and I sat at the kitchen table with Barbara. I placed the manila envelope on the table. I said, "Elena, I need to show you something. I need you to look at it before I say anything, and then you can ask me whatever you want." She looked at the envelope, then at me, then at Barbara. Her face went careful. That particular stillness that people develop when they have spent years half expecting bad news and have learned not to react before they know what kind it is. She opened the envelope. She read slowly. I watched her go through the bank statements, the property record, the timeline sheet I had written. She read the timeline twice. She did not cry. She did not say anything. When she finished, she set the papers down in a neat stack and placed her hands flat on the table on either side of them, as if she needed to feel the table's solidity. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Since Mother's Day," I said. She nodded very slowly. That was the moment the back door opened and Rich walked in. He was still in his brunch clothes, a linen shirt, dark slacks, and he was holding his phone in his hand. He looked at the three of us, looked at the papers on the table, and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. It went for just a fraction of a second, completely blank. The meeting smile was gone. The folded hands' composure was gone. There was nothing there, and then something else replaced it. A controlled, deliberate coldness. "Mom," he said, "what is this?" It wasn't a question. I said, "It's 2 months of your personal bank statements and a county property record. Elena is reading them. Those are private financial documents." His voice was very even. "I don't know how you came to have them, but this is not your business, and it's not appropriate." Barbara said quietly, "The statements were mailed to your mother's address. Public property records are available to anyone." Rich looked at Barbara as though he was noticing her for the first time and had not yet decided what she was. Then he looked back at me. "I'd like to speak to you alone," he said. "No," I said. Something shifted in his posture. He put the phone down on the counter and pulled out the chair across from Elena, the same chair he'd sat in on Mother's Day, and he sat down in it with a deliberateness that was almost theatrical. "Elena," he said, "whatever my mother has shown you, there is context here that she doesn't have. This isn't what it looks like." Elena looked at him. $80,000 a month, she said. Her voice was completely flat. "For 14 months. That's a business arrangement." "The property is in her name," Elena said. I read the record. Rich looked at me, and in that look, I saw something I recognized as a kind of fury. Not explosive, not shouting, but the deep, pressurized kind. He picked up his phone and stepped away from the table and made a call. He spoke in a low voice for about 30 seconds, and then he ended the call and turned back. "I want those documents," he said to me. "I have copies," I said, "in more than one place." "You have no idea," he said slowly, "what you have just done to this family. You have no idea what the consequences of this are. I will not allow my children to be exposed to—" He stopped. He recalibrated. You are not well, Mom. I think the isolation has affected your judgment. These documents are out of context. I intend to speak to an attorney about this. Barbara folded her hands on the table. Dorothy found these documents in mail addressed to her home, she said. She made copies through a commercial copy service, time-stamped. The property record is a public document available on the county auditor's website under Vanessa Moore's name. There's nothing in any of this that creates legal exposure for Dorothy. Rich stood up. I need some time to think, he said. To Elena, don't do anything yet, please. Elena didn't answer. Rich left. We heard the car start in the driveway and then the sound of it backing out. Elena and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The children were still on the back porch. Barbara made fresh coffee. Elena did not cry that afternoon, not in my kitchen. She was the kind of woman who cried privately, and I respected that. She asked me practical questions, the dates, the amounts, the timeline. I answered everything I could. Before she left, she hugged me for a long time in the doorway. Thank you, she said. I knew something. I didn't know what. After they left, I sat in the kitchen alone. I was 67 years old when I taught Rich to drive. I was sitting in that same passenger seat the day he ran the front tire over a curb and looked at me with pure panic, and I said, "It's just a curb. Keep going." I had not stopped thinking of him that way. Not fully. Not even now. I let myself feel that for a few days. I called no one. I tended the garden. I watched the evening news and went to bed early. I gave myself until Friday. Then I got up, made coffee, and kept going. Rich came on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the Sunday. I heard his car in the driveway and recognized the engine before I saw it through the window. He came alone. No Elena. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a simple gray shirt, which meant he had thought about what to wear. Rich in casual clothes meant Rich trying to reach the part of me that remembered him as a boy. He knocked, which he hadn't done in years. He usually just came in. I opened the door and let him in without saying anything. He sat at the kitchen table, the other chair this time, not the one across from me, and put both hands flat on the table, palms down, in a gesture that was either openness or performance. I want to talk, he said. Not argue, just talk. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. He started slowly. He said he knew he had made serious mistakes. He used that word, mistakes, in the careful, bounded way that means I am acknowledging the category without accepting the full weight. He said Vanessa Moore was a situation he had let go too far and was in the process of ending. He said Elena knew the broad strokes now and they were talking. He said the children had not been affected. Then he said he had been thinking about me. He said he had been thinking about how small my house was, how the gutter still leaked, how I spent most of my time alone in a neighborhood that had gotten less safe over the past few years, and how that worried him. He had, he said, found a condominium in a development near Dublin, near him. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a patio garden with southern exposure. Maintenance included, he could transfer the deed to my name. He had also, he said, revised his thinking about the monthly support. $500 had been thoughtless of him. He was prepared to increase it significantly. And he had been talking to a travel agent. There was a garden tour of England in September that he thought I would love. He said all of this in the voice I remembered from when he wanted something, which had always been warmer than his regular voice. He was very good at it. And here is what I want to tell you honestly. I felt it. I am not made of stone. That was my son sitting across from me, offering me a garden with southern exposure. There was a part of me, the part that had driven him to basketball practice in the dark, the part that had cried alone in a parking lot at his graduation, that wanted to accept what he was offering and let the warmth of it cover everything else. That part of me was real. But I had spent 9 days tending my garden and watching the evening news, and I had done a lot of thinking in those 9 days. And what I had thought about most persistently was Elena's hands flat on the table on either side of those documents. The steadying of herself. The steadying of someone who had been trying to hold something together without knowing what was pulling it apart. You cannot unknow a thing. You cannot return to a condition of comfortable ignorance once someone has trusted you with the truth. I had stepped across that line 9 days ago, and the only direction was forward. "Rich," I said, "I love you. I have always loved you, and I always will." But no. He looked at me for a long time. "Mom," he said quietly, "think about what you're doing. Think about the grandchildren. If Elena and I—" He stopped. "Things fall apart when families go to war. Kids get pulled in 2 directions. Are you prepared to be responsible for that?" "That's not my responsibility," I said. "That became your responsibility when you made the choice you made." He sat back. The warmth withdrew, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a blind being lowered. He nodded once. "I'll give you time," he said. "I don't need time," I said. "I need you to be honest with your wife." He left without drinking his coffee. I sat for a while after he was gone. The condominium near Dublin had been a real thing. I could feel its shape in the room even after he left. The patio garden with southern exposure. I made myself think about Elena's hands on the table, and after a moment the shape went away. That afternoon I called Elena. I did not tell her about Rich's visit immediately. First I asked how she was doing. She said she was tired. She said she had an appointment the following week with a family attorney, a woman her colleague had recommended. She asked if I would be willing to speak to the attorney if it came to that, to confirm what I had found and how I had found it. "Of course," I said. "I also want you to know," Elena said, "that I've told my sister Carol about this." She paused. "My sister Carol, not your sister Carol." "I know you have a sister Carol, which is a little strange." I surprised myself by laughing. It was the first time I had laughed in nearly 2 weeks. "My sister Carol has the second copy of the bank statement," I said. It seemed appropriate. Elena was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed too. A short, tired, real laugh. After we hung up, I felt steadier than I had since Mother's Day. There was something in that brief exchange, 2 women laughing at a small absurdity in the middle of a hard thing, that made the ground feel more solid under me. I was not alone. Elena was not alone. The documents were in 3 places. Rich could observe all he liked. They came the following Saturday. I say they because Rich did not come alone this time. He brought his cousin Paul, who was 43 and worked in real estate, and had always been, since they were teenagers together, the person Rich used as a bridge when he wanted to approach something indirectly. Paul had the kind of easy back porch manner that made people lower their defenses. He was a familiar face in my kitchen. He'd eaten hundreds of meals at this table. I offered them coffee. I said nothing to indicate that I was surprised. Paul started. He said he was there because he cared about the family. He said he had known Rich his whole life and knew this situation, like most situations, was more complicated than it looked from the outside. He said that Rich and Elena were already in counseling, which may or may not have been true, and that there was a real chance of the marriage surviving if things were handled within the family. He looked at me with the easy, warm expression he'd been wearing since 1987. "Dot," he said, "you know how these things go when lawyers get involved. It gets expensive, it gets ugly, and it's the kids who pay for it in the end. Marcus and Lily. Rich tells me you're very close to those kids." There it was, not a threat exactly, not something you could point to and say, that was a threat, just a door left open with a cold draft coming through it. "I am close to them," I said. Then you understand, Paul said. What Elena does with this information privately is one thing. But if this goes public, if it becomes part of a legal proceeding, that's not something that can be undone. Rich is their father. His reputation, his ability to provide for those children. His ability to provide seems to be functioning adequately, I said. He manages $80,000 a month for other commitments. Paul's easy expression tightened slightly. He looked at Rich. Rich set his coffee down. He stopped performing warmth. He leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady, and no longer resembled any version of my son I wanted to recognize. Mom, he said, you've spoken to Elena, and now Elena has an attorney. You have involved yourself in my marriage in a way that cannot be taken back. I need you to understand that there are things I can do in response to this. Elena's attorney will want you to testify. I will make sure that any testimony you give is scrutinized very carefully. I will raise the question of whether you are competent to accurately interpret financial documents. You are 71 years old. You live alone. You have been isolated. I am not isolated, I said. And I will have our family physician provide documentation of conversations we've had about your memory and your cognition. We have never had such a conversation. That will raise serious questions about your credibility as a witness. I am not threatening you. He paused. I'm telling you how things will go if this continues. The kitchen was very quiet. I had thought about this possibility. Not this specific version of it, but the general shape of it. The discrediting. I want to be honest and tell you that my heart was beating faster than I would have liked. The mention of Marcus and Lily, said in that particular way, had gone somewhere deep and difficult. And the suggestion about my cognition, about my memory, hit something I couldn't entirely dismiss, because I am 71 years old, and I know what that age means, and I know what people think it means. And the idea of my credibility being publicly questioned was genuinely frightening. But I had learned something during those 9 days of rest in the garden. Fear that moves through you and out the other side is not the same as fear that stops you. I took a breath. I've had coffee with Barbara Ostrowski 3 times in the past 2 weeks, I said. Barbara is a retired paralegal. She's been present for 2 conversations that I would characterize as relevant. She has her own notes. I paused. She's also the person who suggested I keep a dated record of every communication I've had with you since Mother's Day. I've done that. I have it in my files. Paul put his cup down. I think, I said, that what you've described, raising questions about a 71-year-old woman's mental competence in order to discredit her testimony about financial documents that were mailed to her home, is something a family court judge might also find relevant. Rich stood up. The coldness was complete now. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. I'm not done with this conversation, he said. I know, I said, but I am. They left. I sat in the kitchen for 10 minutes without moving. My hands were steady, but something in my chest was shaking in a way that didn't show on the outside. I thought about Marcus and Lily. I thought about their father's voice saying the word competent. I thought about the cold draft through the open door. Then I thought about Elena's hands flat on the table. I went to my desk, opened the log I had been keeping, and wrote the date, the time, and everything that had been said. I noted the presence of Paul. I noted the specific language used. When I was done, I read it back once. Then I called Barbara. The meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of June at the offices of Elena's attorney, a woman named Sandra Marsh, who operated a family law practice in a quiet building on High Street in Worthington. I arrived 15 minutes early with Barbara. We sat in the waiting area. I had brought the manila envelope. I had brought the log. Barbara had brought her own notes in a separate folder. Rich and his attorney arrived 5 minutes before the hour. The attorney was a man I'd never seen before, younger than I expected, with a careful suit, and the kind of expression that is professionally neutral, but registers everything. Rich did not look at me when they came in. He looked at the wall. He had the tight, forward-facing posture of a man preparing to be extremely professional. Sandra Marsh was calm and organized. She had a conference table and a pitcher of water and a folder of her own. She thanked everyone for coming. She explained the purpose of the meeting, to establish the basis of Elena's legal position regarding marital assets and financial conduct during the marriage. She was not hostile in her manner, but she was very precise. She asked me to describe how I had come to possess the bank statements. I told her. Misdirected mail. My name adjacent on the envelope. Opened without awareness of the contents. Recognized Rich's account information. The second statement arrived during an administrative overlap in the mailing update. I had made copies, time-stamped through a commercial copy center. I provided the receipts from the UPS store. Rich's attorney, his name was Carl Briggs, I learned, noted that the original envelopes were addressed to Rich's business address and had been misdirected in error, and that Dorothy had opened mail not intended for her. Sandra Marsh asked me if my name appeared on the envelope. I said it did not appear specifically, but the street address was mine, and the outer label had been partially obscured, which was why the Postal Service had delivered it to my address. Barbara produced her notes from our conversations in early May. She had dated entries describing the substance of what I had shared with her and when, establishing that the documents had been in my possession and that I had been acting in good faith throughout. Carl Briggs made the competence argument. He was careful and measured about it. He said that Dorothy Callahan was a 71-year-old woman living alone, that she had misinterpreted financial documents without full business context, and that the interpretation she had placed on the transfers to V. Moore reflected a misunderstanding of her son's business arrangements. Sandra Marsh asked Carl Briggs if he could provide documentation of V. Moore's status as a business contractor or employee of Callahan Capital Advisors. He said that documentation was being prepared. Sandra Marsh said she would need it within 5 business days, and that in the meantime, she would be entering the property record into the file. The Reinhard Avenue property in German Village, purchased 14 months prior. Cash transaction, $410,000, deed registered under Vanessa R. Moore's personal name. She set the document on the table. A personal residence, she said, purchased in cash, titled in an individual's name in a residential neighborhood, is not a standard business arrangement. Carl Briggs looked at the document. He looked at Rich. Rich said nothing. He was looking at the table now. Sandra Marsh moved to the hotel record. I had printed the confirmation from an email Elena had shared with me from a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, for 4 nights in early April. She noted the dates corresponded with the period during which Rich had told Elena he was in Charlotte for a client conference. She noted the room had been billed to Rich's personal credit card, not the firm's corporate account. Charlotte and Charleston, Sandra Marsh said, in a tone that contained no sarcasm and required none. I may have, Rich started. Richard, Carl Briggs said quietly. Rich stopped. What happened next? I have thought about many times in the months since. Rich looked at Carl Briggs, then at Sandra Marsh, then across the table at Elena, who had been sitting with her hands in her lap for the entire hour, quiet and upright, watching. And something in Rich's careful composure fractured, not dramatically, not a scene, but a small, visible deterioration, like a seam opening. He made a sound that was not quite a word and put one hand briefly over his eyes. Carl Briggs requested a recess. During the recess, Barbara and I stood in the hallway near the elevator. Barbara said nothing, which was the right thing to do. After about 6 minutes, Rich and Carl Briggs came out of a side room, and Carl Briggs approached me, not Rich, Carl Briggs, and said that the question of Dorothy's competence would not be raised in these proceedings. I thanked him in the tone I used when I meant nothing by it. When we reconvened, Rich's position had changed entirely. He no longer contested the documents. He no longer contested the context. His attorney engaged with Sandra Marsh in the language of settlement parameters, which meant the argument was no longer about what was true. It was about what would happen next. Elena signed the beginning of a legal action at the end of the meeting. On the drive home, Barbara and I did not talk about what had happened in the room. We talked about her begonias, which were coming in well this year, and about a restaurant on Morse Road that she'd heard had a good breakfast menu. When I got home, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The afternoon sun came through the window over the sink and lit up the table in a long rectangle. I thought, it is done now. The thing that needed to happen has happened. And then I thought, I need to fix the gutter. The divorce took 8 months. I will not tell you it was clean or simple, because nothing in family law is. There were motions and counter-motions and periods of weeks where nothing seemed to move, and then days where everything moved at once. Sandra Marsh was thorough. Carl Briggs negotiated. Rich and Elena spoke as little as possible through attorneys and email threads. I was a witness once briefly in a deposition conducted in Sandra Marsh's conference room. I described the envelopes. I described the dates. Barbara sat in the hallway outside and waited. The competence argument was not raised. The financial record that Sandra Marsh had constructed over those months was, in the end, the thing that settled the case. Rich did not contest most of it in the final stages. The 14 months of transfers to Vanessa Moore had been traced and documented, totaling approximately $1.1 million in direct transfers, with additional expenditures: the Charleston Hotel, jewelry, a ski trip in January I hadn't known about, charges at restaurants I'd never heard of. That brought the assessed figure considerably higher. Under Ohio's equitable distribution statute, marital waste is taken into account in the division of assets. Sandra Marsh knew her law. The settlement gave Elena the Dublin house, or its full equity value. She chose the equity, sold the house within 60 days, and moved with Marcus and Lily to a neighborhood in Westerville she'd always liked, closer to her practice. She received a significant share of Rich's investment accounts. The children's college funds were untouched and placed in custodial accounts. Child and spousal support were calculated and fixed. Rich kept the firm. His income had not changed. I do not know what happened between Rich and Vanessa Moore after the proceedings began. I know that the Reinhard Avenue property was eventually listed for sale, and that I read about it on the county auditor's website one afternoon without having looked for it. I wrote nothing in my log about that. It felt like information that didn't belong to me anymore. Rich and I did not speak for the first 5 months after the meeting at Sandra Marsh's office. The silence was his. I did not pursue it. In November, about a month after the divorce was finalized, I received a card in the mail. No letter, no note. Just a card. One of those generic autumn scene cards from a pharmacy display. Rich had written inside it, "I know I was wrong. I don't know yet what I want to say about it. I'll call when I can." I put the card in my file drawer, in the same folder where I kept the log. He had not called by the time December came. I did not wait for the call or worry about it. I understood that there were some distances that could only be crossed at a person's own pace, and that I had done what I had done not for the purpose of a reconciliation, but for the purpose of the truth. If Rich found his way back across that distance one day, I would be here. If he didn't, that would be its own kind of answer. Elena brought the children to Thanksgiving dinner at my house that year. It was the 4 of us, Elena, Marcus, Lily, and me, and we ate at the kitchen table, and I made the pumpkin pie from Gerald's mother's recipe. Marcus, who had turned 15 and was going through the quiet period most 15-year-olds go through, helped me set the table without being asked. Lily told me about a book she was reading. Elena brought a bottle of wine, and we each had a glass with dinner, which we had never done before. After the children went to watch television in the living room, Elena and I sat at the kitchen table over the remains of the pie, and she said quietly, "I want you to know that you did the right thing." "I know," I said, which was true. "I also want you to know," she said, "that I spent a long time being angry at you too, in the early months. I know that doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense," I said. "I'm the one who made it impossible to look away." She nodded. "That's exactly what it felt like." "I'm sorry for the hard months," I said. "I'm not sorry for showing you." She picked up her wine glass. "No," she said. "Neither am I." We sat together in my kitchen until the pie was gone and the children had fallen asleep on the couch. I looked at the window over the sink where the evening had gone fully dark. The gutter was fixed. I had hired a young man from the neighborhood in July, and he had done a thorough job for a fair price. The begonia Elena had given me on Mother's Day was still on the counter, still alive, which surprised me every week. The house felt quiet, but not empty. There is a difference. Empty is when the quiet has nothing in it. This quiet had Gerald in the walls and something new in the present tense. The knowledge that I had looked at something hard and not looked away from it. That was enough for me. That has always been enough for me. By the following spring, I had settled into a life that I would describe, without exaggeration, as good. I want to be careful about how I say that, because good is not the same as easy or the same as without grief. I had lost something over the previous year that I was still in the process of understanding. A version of my son that had lived partly in my imagination, simpler and more whole than the real one. Letting that version go is its own kind of mourning, and I did not rush it. But I had my garden, and it was a good spring for it. The tomatoes came in strong. The herbs along the south fence, Gerald's herbs technically, though I had tended them for 26 years, were lush in a way they hadn't been for several seasons. I bought a good pair of kneeling pads and spent 2 or 3 hours outside most mornings when the weather permitted. Barbara and I had breakfast at the restaurant on Morse Road most Thursdays. They had a good omelet and strong coffee, and the booth in the back was always available at 9:15. We talked about the neighborhood, about her begonias, about the books we were reading. We did not often talk about the previous year. It existed between us as context, not conversation. Elena had found her footing. She and the children were in Westerville now, in a brick Tudor with a backyard big enough for Lily to set up an easel and paint outside. Her practice had expanded. She'd taken on a second physician as a partner, which meant she could reduce her own hours slightly. She was sleeping better. She said that plainly, without additional context, on one of our Sunday calls. "I'm sleeping better." I understood the full weight of it. Marcus had turned 16 and was interested in architecture. He had begun drawing floor plans freehand, measuring rooms with a tape measure and reproducing them on graph paper. Elena showed me one over video call, and it was genuinely good. He had his grandfather's precision, which made me feel something I didn't have a word for. Lily was 12 and consuming books at a rate that required 2 library visits a week. She called me on Wednesdays sometimes and read me passages she wanted to share. We had developed a genuine literary friendship, the kind that exists between people who are 59 years apart and have found common ground anyway. Rich's life had contracted. I say this not with satisfaction, though I will not pretend to a purity of feeling that isn't there. 2 clients left the firm in the 6 months following the divorce item that appeared in a local business publication. A partnership discussion with a larger firm in Cincinnati went quiet. He retained the firm and his income, though at reduced volume. He was not ruined. Rich had built something real, and it did not collapse. But it was smaller and quieter, and I believe he felt that smallness as a constant awareness rather than a single event. He called me in March, 8 months after the card. The call lasted 22 minutes. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he understood that what I had done was, in some narrow and painful sense, the thing a mother does when she acts from love rather than loyalty. I said that was fair. I said I loved him and would continue to love him. We spoke again the following month and the month after that. Short, careful, honest calls. Two people who had hurt each other in complicated ways, finding out whether there was something solid still underneath. I think there was. As for Vanessa Moore, the Reinhardt Avenue property sold in October. A young couple purchased it. The rosemary topiary in the planter was gone in the new listing photos. I do not know where she went or what became of the life that had been maintained so expensively and secretly. She had been a person in this story, too. What followed from her choices was hers to carry. I spent the first Sunday in May planting sweet peas along the back fence. Gerald had planted sweet peas the spring before he died, and I had not planted them since. I pressed the seeds into the soil one by one, tamped the earth down with my thumb, and thought about nothing in particular. The afternoon was warm. The gutter was doing fine. People ask me sometimes whether I regret it. I never do. Here is what I learned at 71 years old, in my kitchen with a misdirected envelope. Silence is not kindness. Silence, when it protects a lie, is just a different kind of harm wearing a quieter face. Every day I kept quiet. Elena went to work and felt the hollow of a life she didn't understand. The truth doesn't need your permission to be true, but it sometimes needs one person willing to carry it forward. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment. I'd love to know. And thank you for listening.